So James the First was basically persecuting large groups of large religious groups in England. As I previously said, he had issued this oath of allegiance in 1606, forcing Catholics to accept basically the head of the Church of England, that being the king, as their ultimate earthly authority. And this was very difficult for Catholics because of their relationship with the Pope in Rome. This only led to further dissatisfaction with the king, and not just by Catholics. As I previously said, there were the Puritans who wanted to purify the Church of England. And James I began to sort of crack down on all groups that he felt were challenging his authority. So Catholics, Puritans fell on that list. And this is the period, of course, where you begin to see so many groups being persecuted that some are simply exiled. And where do they go? They go to the New World. Or they are basically able to get passage on a ship. Many Protestants first found their way to Holland, the Netherlands, but soon decided to make the very difficult and dangerous journey to the New World, to America. Where they would have the opportunity, of course, to create their own Christian utopia, basically, as they saw it. But back in England, James I was... he saw himself again as very much able to do this because, again, the divine right of kings told him it was all right to do it, because he had ultimate power, ultimate authority, by God, nonetheless. James I continued to present himself, as I said, as the head of the Church of England, and he played ball with the English to a certain extent. For instance, if he wanted to levy taxes, he always went before Parliament. But James I died in 1625, and the next Stuart in line was Charles I, who ruled from 1625 until his execution in 1649. Charles I believed very much in the divine right of kings, and decided basically to not play ball with the English. And this is the beginning of the challenge by the King of England against limited monarchy. And by limited monarchy, again, what we mean is that the king or queen has great control and power in England, but that it is limited. It is limited by Parliament via the Magna Carta. And Charles I basically said, forget the Magna Carta and forget Parliament, going so far as to disbanding Parliament. From 1629 until the year 1640, he disbanded Parliament and did basically whatever he wanted. He would levy taxes without any decree, that is, without authority of Parliament. He also allowed systematic persecutions of Puritans. Again, this is a period of major sort of a migration, if you will, a mass migration from England to, as I said, either Holland or to the New World. And this was, of course, very unpopular within England. But eventually Charles found himself, he found himself in trouble by his own design. This happened when he tried to force his fellow Scots, which largely had by this time accepted Presbyterianism, a Protestant religion, and he was trying to now push the English Anglican forms of religion, the Church of England, on the Presbyterian Scots. And they didn't take that very lightly. In fact, they rose in revolt in the year 1638. He was desperate for money for basically a war against his own people in order to put down this revolt. And who do you think he goes to? Parliament. So he goes before basically a disbanded parliament, asks them to help him raise taxes throughout the country, and they refused. This then basically led to a couple of events that led to ultimately the English Civil War. The first of which was that this parliament condemned to death Charles I, his chief minister. And in retaliation, Charles tried to basically arrest 5 members of parliament without really any lawful authority. And in doing so, the country split and civil war broke out. So you have those who see the king as truly that divine being on the throne, and so you have the king and certain parts of the army, the military, and certain Englishmen, particularly nobility, who want to keep their titles, take the side of the king, and then you see a whole other part of England basically go to war with the King of England. And this is known as the English Civil War. It lasted from 1642 until 1651, and it was a very, very bloody civil war. The major outcomes of this war is that one, Charles I lost the war, and he was basically imprisoned. He was sort of imprisoned in his own palace, if you will, but he was being forced to accept the Magna Carta, etc. He refused to do so, and he was then put on trial. He was put on trial, and then he was executed in the name, basically, of the people of England. The person who had been kind of at the head of the parliamentary army, which fought against the king, was a man named Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell certainly, by this time, was becoming a very powerful figure within Parliament, within England itself. And he definitely had a major part to play in the execution of the king. This meant that the King of England had been executed by his own people. And that basically there was going to be an entirely new government in England. It would certainly not be a monarchy. They wouldn't have gone to war for so long only to put another king on the throne, right? So they exiled Charles I's son, who would later be Charles II, because they didn't want him to take the throne. And they basically allowed Oliver Cromwell to become more or less dictator. And of course, he sort of took on these powers one by one. This is the period known as the Commonwealth of England, from 1649 until 1653. And when Cromwell felt he basically had enough power to rule on his own in this sort of puritanical theocracy, he created the so-called Protectorate of England from 1653 until 1659, in which he called himself Lord Protector of England. He was not popular. Although he did, he never was actually assassinated, and he died of natural causes. And when he died, the English people said, we want another king, but this time, of course, it must be a king that will play ball, accept the Magna Carta, and of course, he must be Protestant. And they called back the exiled son of Charles. And so in the year 1660, Charles II took the throne. 1660 is referred to in English history as the Restoration, meaning it was the restoration of the Stuart dynasty. He ruled until 1685. That was a very happy period for England. Great advances in science and art, literature, and so on. But Charles II died in 1685. When he died, his younger brother, James II, became king in 1685. And James, again, believed he was a closet Catholic, or maybe in this case, less of the closeted part and more of just the Catholic part. And he took a very authoritarian stance, and he believed, of course, in the divine right of kings. He had opponents murdered or imprisoned. He defied the Parliament's orders. And the people of England had basically a choice. Do we once again rise in revolt against our king, or do we basically wait this king out? They decided to wait him out because James had thus far been unable to secure his line, meaning he had not had a male heir. That changed, though, when he did have a male heir, and the people of England and the Parliament and so on knew, and the military knew, that that son would grow up to be just like his father, and they couldn't allow that. This leads to, in the year 1688, what the English referred to as the Glorious Revolution, where they asked Mary Stuart, who had been James's Protestant daughter, which he had exiled to Holland. Mary Stuart and her husband, William III of Orange, who was this prince in Orange in Holland. And the English asked them to come, throw James II off the throne, and rule jointly in a Protestant monarchy, which of course would accept the Magna Carta. And they did so. And again, it was relatively bloodless, and so therefore it was referred to as the Glorious Revolution. James II fled, I think, to France, and there was now a Protestant joint monarchy. Perhaps the ultimate importance of this is it puts to rest all of this terrible period for England. So what are the major effects of these two coming to the throne and the Glorious Revolution of 1688? One is that Parliament established its freedom from monarchical rule. Now the king would no longer derive his power from God, but from the people themselves. And in the following year, 1689, they were the Mary and her husband William had to accept the English Bill of Rights, in which they gave up royal right to suspend laws, to appoint special courts, to keep their own standing army, and of course to levy taxes except without Parliament's consent. Great, everything is reestablished, but the English Bill of Rights go further. Things like freedom of speech were guaranteed to the people. And I'm sure you can clearly see that this English Bill of Rights in 1689 would later lead to our own American Bill of Rights in our Constitution. It had an even more direct influence in 1689 in that colonists in Boston looked at the Glorious Revolution and said, that means that if a king or queen or a ruler is a tyrant, that they can be overthrown. We have the right to overthrow them as Englishmen. And in Boston, they did this in 1689 against the Governor Andros. And so you can see a very direct influence of the Glorious Revolution in American history, and you can see sort of more indirect in that, of course, in the American Revolution, the people will rise against King George III. So the Glorious Revolution ends this period of Stuart rule, and it reestablishes a Protestant on the throne. Therefore, the English avoid absolutism and the divine right of kings.